What is actionable science? That is the question of the day. Welcome back to another episode of ScioSophia, your home for raw, unfiltered, informal science and topics discussed therein. Welcome back. I'm Adrian, climate scientist, crafter, amateur philosopher. We're going to get into it. This is a little bit interesting because actionable science is not a concept that most are familiar with. As you're going to see from some of the literature that I'm going to cite today, the concept as an idea is roughly only about 20 years old in the US. So it's really, really new. And as we're going to see, it's potentially very useful. But at the same time, it's also potentially concerning, and particularly as we find ourselves in the politicized climate that we have ourselves in the U.S. today. That's what I want to get into by the end of it. I have books over here, too, that I'm going to eventually be citing as part of this whole discussion. But first off, let's get right into it. And of course, with our usual entomology, let's start off with that. Or, I'm sorry, etymology, not entomology. Entomology is the study of bugs. Etymology, study of words, study of the origin of words. Anyway, sorry, I keep mispronouncing that. It's terrible. So actionable. We know from science, from the introduction video to this channel. You know as I do now that science is drawn from the Latin scire, meaning to know, and scio, the first word of this channel. Scio is literally know. The word know, as in I know this or I know that, and that's what's used to form the first part of the title for this channel. Actionable, as we're talking about here, is furnishing sufficient grounds for a legal action. You see legal in parentheses there because obviously it could just mean action. But of course, we have our somewhat circular definitions here, but you get the sense with actionable, the idea is grounds for actually taking action for something. So actionable science is being able to know enough to have sufficient grounds to take an action. And since we don't like circular definitions on this channel as much as I can possibly avoid them, let's see the word action itself. Case or grounds for a lawsuit from the Anglo-French. Old French action meaning action, lawsuit case. Again, why do we do circular definitions? But it comes from the Latin actionem. I'm pronouncing it wrong. And the nominative actio, putting in motion, performing, doing, public acts, official conduct, lawsuit, legal action. There's a lot of legal, as you might guess with some of this. Noun of action stems from the past participle of agere, to do. So in other words, to know and to do end up being together in the same thing here. But it's being able to do something. And so actionable science, if you take it from the etymology, would be the sense of, okay, I want enough knowledge to be able to do something with it. And that's actually a pretty fair description of what is actually in the literature, too, at the same time, in a very short order form of it. What's in the literature describes very nicely the idea of what actionable science is. But to get to what actionable science is, we got to take a hot second to actually also to give you the baseline of what isn't actionable science. So we're going to do this a little bit by contrast today. And this is a good study to do that with in Conservation Letters. Here. It's an open, most of what I'm going to cite today is open access, so I will link this all in the description for you, but some of it is not, unfortunately, so I can't do all of that, but I will endeavor my best to try and make sure that you, general audience, don't need to deal with paywalls to get to see what these articles are. So, in this article, they talk a little bit about, and this is another thing if you seek actionable science, and actionable science in the last 20 years really did start a lot from the climate science community, at least from what I can find. So this is in my wheelhouse, as you all know. And so it gets into something interesting. So often with actionable science, you will also see this term co-production. And there's a reason for that. I'm going to get into that in a second. So in the introduction here, they say, in the loading dock approach to linking science and action, science producers interact with resource managers, decision makers, or policy makers, henceforth managers, in a linear transaction. In one variant of this approach, the manager contracts with the scientist for a specific product which is delivered to the manager's desk and may later be used to inform management decisions. In another variant, a funder not affiliated with the manager might award a scientist a grant to develop a science product regardless of whether the manager has asked for it. Okay. This is called the loading dock approach for a very good reason, and it provides it's a very good I apologize if I start having sound issues again. I'm still having issues with the cord, even though I've changed out the cord. So I apologize if I continue to have sound issues. We're going to try and avoid that. But the loading dock approach here is the whole idea that I'm a scientist, I do research, it's peer-reviewed, it's published in a journal, it's there. It's there on the loading dock and been published, it's there on the loading dock for somebody to come pick it up. And of course, for those of us, some of us involved doing impact assessments and climate-related stuff and what have you, or anybody who wants to get their science used by a decision maker or by a planner, this is kind of sometimes doesn't work in the sense that if it goes out there and yes, a funder is paid for it, somebody wants it because somebody paid for the grant to actually get this done. But you end up not having the having it be useful, having managers actually come to get it. So they actually say this themselves in this article. The scientific product sits in a peer-reviewed literature, a big loading dock, until a manager finds it. In the latter variant, the scientist might take the additional step of outreach or science communication, making managers and those who influence managers aware the products exist. The loading dock approach works best in situations in which the manager knows what questions to ask, and the scientific answers are readily applied at the spatial scale. Readily apply at the spatial scale, I apologize, a political or property boundary, and temporal scale, next year's budget, or what have you, faced by the manager. And this is the thing, is a lot of times, because we're just dumping things out there with peer review and what have you, it sometimes just doesn't end up being useful at all. It's like manager will look at that and I'll say something, oh, I've got this great thing that I've just done, and what have you, and a manager will look at you cross-eyed and be like, so? I don't care. I absolutely do not care because that does not help me. And that's the kind of loading dock approach. Eventually somebody will pick it up. And often with the loading dock kind of method of doing science, which is typical and standard, and there's nothing wrong with that in the sense that, another scientist will pick it up and obviously do some research with it or cite it or want to refute it or any number of different things. So it does still get out there and get used. But in the terms of getting it to a manager or a decision maker, the loading dock approach isn't helpful. And one of the things with it, of course, with the loading dock idea is that you have the situation of, I'm a manager. I can't spend all my time going through peer-reviewed literature to find something that will hopefully in some obscure way help me do something. And so that's the problem with the loading dock approach is it works well for the scientific community, particularly to make sure they can get there. And it works well for some managers who already know what they want, already know what questions to ask, what kinds of studies they need to look into to find things. And hopefully there's something in a geographic domain of mine that can help me with my particular area, like my park over here. And that's the interesting thing with it is that sometimes it doesn't work that way. As they go on to say here, some problems are not well served by the loading dock approach. For example, the problem of adaptation to climate change involves complex phenomena such as rain shifts, phenotypic plasticity, and evolutionary potential of many interacting species in response to multiple, highly uncertain climate scenarios that occur at spatial scales beyond the manager's sphere of influence and at temporal scales beyond the manager's budget or planning cycle. And that's the thing, is that particularly in climate science, and I know this is possibly true in other sciences too, that you have more and more planners, decision makers, state, local, federal, tribal, all of them coming to ask questions of, this is going to affect some species of importance here in my region, this is going to affect crops over here, this is going to affect land and infrastructure. Think of it the fact that climate really does in fact touch on everything. With climate, you have the consideration of what can I build in an area? Thinking of the frequency of tornadoes, for instance, or the frequency of hurricanes, or any number of those different things. That's connected to climate. You have water quality and water quantity issues. So think of New Mexico versus Louisiana. New Mexico is very dry compared to Louisiana, which is much more wet climate. So there's two different water issues. One of them has too little, some of them have too much. Louisiana can have too much. climate affects what plants can grow where, what habitats are available for different species, whether species can thrive in a certain part of the country, a certain part of the world. So climate really does impact everything, and there's a lot of intertangled, complex phenomena, particularly when you get into dealing with ecosystems as it pertains to climate, or crops as it deals with climate. So if you think about the evolution of science and related to this, you've had physics and chemistry, and then you get into meteorology and ecology and biology and genetics, microbiology, all these kinds of things. And so you're reaching a point where some of the questions that decision makers are asking us about involve intertangling connections between multiple different disciplines. And the challenges and some of the things going on in climate science right now, and particularly adaptation to climate change, as they're talking about here, involve that level of interaction and incredibly complex questions, thinking about all the different things that might affect this thing, that this area, that this particular decision maker is interested in. And so that's why the loading dock doesn't necessarily help, because the questions are getting really specified. So let's see. Yeah, in the first years, usually at the request of managers. Nonetheless, the reaction of many managers was, "What do I do with these vulnerability assessments? Why did I ask for them?" Many vulnerability assessments remain on the loading dock, yet to support adaptation decisions. So the thing about actionable science is, it's in a way, it's defined as data, analyses, projections, or tools that can support decisions in natural resource management. And this is not necessarily limited to only natural resource management now. So this article is a little older, I think. 2016, yeah, so it's a little older now. It's not necessarily limited to just natural resource management now, but the idea with actionable science is that it must be well, here we go. Just read down a little further, right? So here's the thing. So actionable science that can support decisions. So it's doing science to support somebody taking some kind of an action, as we got into with the etymology. Defining co-production as collaboration among managers, the scientists, and other stakeholders who, after identifying specific decisions to be informed by the science, jointly define the scope and context of the problem, research questions, methods, and outputs, make scientific inferences, and develop strategies for the appropriate use of science. We use the term partners to collectively refer to these co-producers. Okay. This is the thing that makes the loading dock versus the actionable science approach different. In the loading dock, scientist is working on their merry way. They answer whatever questions they want, or whatever questions the funder of the grant that they get wants. But the difference here with actionable science is now there are specific stakeholders, specific end users, decision makers, policymakers. They can be park managers, they can be crops, they can be folks like USDA, any number of different people at the end goal here. And it can be even local citizens, local communities. It's definitely possible. I don't know of an example where that's actually happened yet, but that's definitely possible. But you get into this thing of the end users, the people who are ultimately going to be using this information to make the decision, are helping to inform exactly what the research questions are. And this I actually think is a really good thing. And I'll get into that in a lot more depth soon. But the reason it's such a good thing is that it brings in really divergent perspectives. It brings in different perspectives, because as a scientist, we're trained to think certain ways. We're trained to look at these things and get creative about asking questions. Yes, but we get so deeply involved in it ourselves. Like an old research mentor said to me, the old scientists are so deeply invested and so ingrained in it, do it every day, that sometimes they miss some of the really intriguing questions that a young scientist would come up with, because they're fresh and they're creative and what have you. And it's because that young scientist coming in and not being fully immersed in the scientific process just yet can come up with a really unique question to ask that somebody else hadn't thought of, because they've been so locked into their own kind of way of doing things. So I do really think the actionable science kind of idea is really, really useful in that it brings a divergent perspective, so that you can say, okay, scientists might have this particular question, but I have this particular question over here. So what's the research question that marries those two things together? The really creative, unique research question that can do it. And with actionable science, you can get to the point of Getting into questions that reveal things that you didn't consider before. This is why a lot of things I do actually involve direct input with stakeholders and things that I do research-wise, because I want to get into some weird questions that are not necessarily considered just from the physical science perspective, but then also to say, okay, I don't know where I was going with that. I lost it. Sorry. It may come back to me later, but I lost it altogether just now. But it basically makes it possible to ask some really unique, creative questions. As one of the reasons why we like this idea of actual science. I like it. Getting a chance to interact with somebody who does not at all have the same perspective that I do. Let's see. Another variant of that. So this is another good state. I think this one's not available. I think this one's behind a paywall, so unfortunately I don't know that I can get this one linked. I will at least link the abstract, if nothing else. So he talks about this too, Gus. In recent years, a more diverse audience, tighter budgets, and growing awareness of the effects of changing climatic conditions on natural and cultural resources have increased the urgency to identify pressing resource management decisions that may benefit from robust science contributions. And as I said with the other article, this is not necessarily limited to natural resources. The author here happens to work for a center that's out of the Department of the Interior and so is focused on natural resources, so that's his thing. This recognition has catapulted the concept of actionable science as an effort to focus scientific climate research toward addressing specific resource management questions. So there's a couple of different things that are required to do actionable science when you're having that interaction between scientists and stakeholders, as we tend to call them, or managers or end users. But this is basically anybody in a position that would be making a decision. The first pillar in this is a priori. You need some kind of articulation of what is the priority or the decision related that we need to address. That's sort of the demand function of this thing. Gus here, in the author of the article, likens this to supply and demand, which is a very good way to think of it. So this is the demand from the decision side of things. This is the decision I need to make, and this is the sort of sensitive area that we need to think about. Simply put, if the decision maker fails to clearly articulate the impending management decision of interest, then the scientist's likelihood of being able to supply relevant scientific products decreases considerably. Makes sense? Second pillar embodies the supply function, a suitable research agenda, and ensuing products and services that the scientific community proposes to best inform the decision-making process. Within a publicly funded program, the sequential arrangement of these two functions is imperative for managers' clear expression of their top decisions or planning actions is a prerequisite to guide and inspire scientific activity that delivers the necessary information and products. The third pillar symbolizes the negotiation that ensues between managers and scientists to understand the complexities and conditions of their demand and supply transaction, and fine-tune the terms to a contractual arrangement. What does all that gobbledygook mean? Often, what will happen is we have, it means in a situation that you can have decision maker asks and demands this thing, scientist says, I can give you this thing over here. In other words, to say, we know that that's what you really want. Science isn't there to give it to you yet, for whatever reason, because of our lack of understanding of something, or technology issues with measurement, or not having observations of something. Any number of different reasons we can't get there to give you that yet. So there's a give and take there from what a decision maker wants, or what an end user stakeholder wants, or and what is possible. And that is the interesting give and take that they're talking about in that, and getting it figured out of what is the thing that we can actually answer, that a science is actually capable of answering, not the thing that the decision maker always wants, and it's certainly not always the thing a scientist wants to do either. So there's a negotiation there. The conceptual demand and supply relationship sets the stage for an early association between a community of science producers, scientists, and another one of science users, managers, working together on a common problem from the very beginning. And that is the key thing. Loading dock is always, it comes in at the end. Is the relationship between scientist and stakeholder always comes in at the end. Actionable science starts at the beginning. You have immediate relationship between who's producing science, who's going to use it, who's producing knowledge, I should say, and who's going to use it. This association or co-production between science producers and science users has been heralded as the most effective approach to minimize the gap between science producers and users and to maximize the likelihood for science to effectively inform management policies. And he goes on to point out a couple of important things, actually. The first issue with it, of course, is identity. I don't like the word identity here. I think the first issue with this is the role, but fair enough, whatever. Who are the science users? Who are the science producers? This can sometimes be difficult or perhaps artificial dichotomy that does and does not reflect, darn it, the complex reality that many managers are actively involved in the generation of new science information, whereas others have no interest or involvement in the scientific process at all. This is true. So think of your local city council official. They're never going to be involved in actually doing the scientific knowledge, doing analysis, gathering data, information, all that. They're not going to be involved directly in all of that, unless they have a science background, in which case they might be peripherally involved. But somebody who is themselves an expert in ecology or biology or any number of different things and just happens to be in a position of administrative authority, being a park manager or a refuge manager or anything like that, they may actually also be a producer of science information themselves and want to be more involved. So that's a tricky sort of part of it here with Actionable Science 2 that doesn't come up in the loading dock sort of approach. The second issue that merits attention has to do with managers representing federal, state, indigenous, and other natural resource organizations, or just other organizations, period, who fail to clearly articulate the top climate-sensitive management priorities and decision points concerning the natural and cultural resources they administer. Again, he's writing this article from the standpoint of natural and cultural resources because the center he works in, the author works in. So, but you could think of this as in terms of any kind of organization or any kind of thing where they're needing to make a decision. So the problem that can happen is that we say, "What are your science needs?" You know, what kind of no, we ask them to tell us, what is the in an actionable science framework, you would ask them to tell us what are the management needs? What are your priorities for managing? What kind of decision are you trying to make? And it immediately jumps in their heads to what is the science need? So suddenly management need and science need becomes the same thing when they're not necessarily the same thing at all. Sometimes they can be. Oftentimes they're not necessarily. Because these lists of science needs originate from the managers, they become, in the absence of careful thought, management needs. Suddenly, management needs and science needs are confounded and effectively become the same thing. Both terms focus exclusively on desired science products, and neither one offers a satisfactory response to the original request regarding the crucial management priorities that drive and justify the pursuit of science products. So data sets, analyses, projections, and things. The inconsistency here is having science users itemize elements they wish to have supplied to them instead of articulating clear statements of demand. The erroneous conflation of the terms management needs and science needs is far more consequential than a mere semantic preference and makes a tremendous difference in understanding the demand and supply terms in the context of the science and manager partnership. So that relationship between me, scientist, and you, end user, is what they're talking about in that. And that is an issue because they don't realize this is the thing I need for management, but this is also, what is this thing I need for the knowledge side of it? Also, and that's what we mean by the science need in all of this, is the knowledge side of things. So it's a conflation that's a problem, and it does happen. So this is a challenge with actionable science, is figuring out what is a management need versus what is a science need, or what knowledge do I need to make the decision. The management need may not be the same thing. And also understanding the justification for doing the research is the decision that somebody's trying to make. So having what that management priority is and what the decisions are is kind of a critical, important thing there, because it is the justification for doing the work. The third observation encountered on occasion in the umbrella of this corresponds to scientists who expect to secure funding for their proposed work regardless of its management relevance. The vacuum generated when managers fail to articulate their priorities does not remain vacant for long. The creative minds within the scientific community do not hesitate to fill those voids in the desired management demand narrative and quickly advance a few elegant research ideas or offer multiple sophisticated scientific and technological products, all while highlighting that their best guess at potential management applications and presumed benefits to inform decisions. Okay. This has to do with the challenge of funding. Actionable science has become a lot more popular to do, so more funders have been going for it, as you will, saying, hey, we'll fund this. And some of the research grants now have been asking you to have a stakeholder ahead of time to say, I want this to the funder. And so I think you should fund this because I want to use it. I want to make sure I'm going to be actively involved. So there is more of that coming along. But this is the challenge, is that they want to secure, scientists, of course, we want to keep paying ourselves and paying our students. So, hey, yes, we want to get funding for ourselves regardless of whether it's relevant. So if we can't get funding off of something that involves the stakeholder, then we may just, I'll go on and do something else. And then somebody else will come in and fill that void with the stakeholder. But that does make it difficult also to form that relationship between stakeholder and end user because of the thing of we got to be able to pay ourselves as scientists with whatever grant funding we can get. And sometimes you don't get it because actionable science tends to be harder to do and doesn't necessarily immediately lend itself to getting a lot of papers published or all the kinds of metrics that we might use, which I may do that as a video myself so people can understand some of the fun things of science. So there's lots of interesting things like that go on. And there's a couple of different articles. Where is it? There it is. Couple of different articles that we could also talk about here. And you find these if you do a Google Scholar search on actionable science. You will see a lot of interesting things like this, particularly if you're doing actionable climate science or anything like that, you will see them. So again, actionable science has three characteristics. First, it is salient and context sensitive, reflecting the unique conditions and constraints of the problem in question. And of course, that has to do with stakeholder has a problem. I, a scientist, am interested in helping to figure out figure out the answers to the questions associated with that problem. So it becomes very context specific going on in here and can lead to some very interesting things. Second, it is credible in that it was produced and vetted according to accepted standards of excellence in practice, including but not limited to peer-reviewed publications. And as you can see here, the cache at all things 2002. That's just says something about how old the idea of actionable science is here, with that being only about 20 years ago with that particular article. And yeah, credible. You got to meet the standards for science is what they're saying with this. And third, it must be legitimate in that the intended users of the information must believe that the information was produced without political persuasion. I think they mean persuasion or bias. Legitimacy is grounded in the development and maintenance of relationships based on mutual trust and respect. Each of these three qualities needs to exist simultaneously, and increasing one does not overcome shortcomings in another quality. Another dimension of actionable or usable science is that it is iterative, where engagement between producers and users of information must occur early, often, and throughout the duration of the project in what has been called a symbiotic relationship. And that is truly what is meant here, as opposed to the loading dock approach where you just dump it out there and you hope somebody picks it up. You got somebody involved all the time. I'm beating a little bit of a dead horse here, but it helps you get the point. The difference between the loading dock primarily and the actionable science is the big relationship between the user and the producer of the science information. And that's where it becomes important. And this thing here, produced without political persuasion or bias, this is something I want to get into a little bit more because I do have some concerns of what can happen with actionable science. Overall, I think actionable science is very good. It is a very good thing. And particularly as we're getting into more and more complicated questions, and we're reaching a point in science history where you're starting to have lots of interactions between disciplines of things here as those questions are getting more and more complex and trying to figure out knowledge of the world around us and having those interactions between those disciplines. We've been sort of siloed off for a long time, but particularly climate change is a good example of it, where you're starting to have interactions between a huge number of disciplines, and that's a good thing. I think it's a very good thing to have those relationships and interactions. I also think it's a very good thing to have decision makers, stakeholders involved and helping to guide what those questions are that we need answered so that we can use scientific information more effectively and efficiently. Where it's appropriate. That doesn't mean basic research goes away. It doesn't mean the loading dock goes away. The basic research and loading dock stuff is still actually very important because there are still basic research questions in each discipline that need to be answered and need to be explored. But the this is where it gets interesting, is that now you've got so many kinds of questions. I've lost track of the number of papers where it's climate change and this, or it's climate change and that, or it's any number of different things, where you have huge interactions. You have COVID communication and health risks and all these kind of other things. And we talked about this on the Cyworthy conversation, actually, recently. Types of experiments now where you're crossing between social and physical sciences. It goes to like a couple of different studies that I had mentioned with my colleague the other day. But that's interesting in and of itself, and it is a good thing. I like I said, new perspectives and interesting perspectives from outside of science to inform questions and advance science itself in ways that we could not have foreseen. Very good. I'm totally on board with it. Totally on board with it. The problem is, for me, the concern that I have that actionable science can convert into activist science. And I got a problem with that. And here's a good example article of why I got a problem with that. So I don't even know what this journal is. Very strange journal of community practice. So this is an article from 2014. So this would have been about 10 years into the concept of actionable science being a thing. Community practice and actionable science share a commitment to solving complex problems to promote sustainability. Take a stop right there. Did I say anything about actionable science being there to promote sustainability in any of the articles that I read? No, not necessarily. Solving complex problems, but the motivations behind doing so, that's something else. For some of the scientists doing it, absolutely. It could be to promote sustainability. I'm not saying that's not possible. I'm just saying this is an assumption straight off the gate that is exactly the reason why someone would want to do actionable science. Complex problems are a starting point for engaged research in community practice and actionable science. Deeply entangled social, ecological, and economic problems have been described as wicked due to their cross-scale interactions, indefinite thresholds, and apparent intractability. So this is a very true statement, actually, with respect to climate science in particular. It has become a very intertangled in a lot of things, as we're talking about, of course, the human influence on the environment, but then also how the environment responds to that, and then what does that mean, how the climate in particular responds to that, and then what does that mean for ecosystems, agriculture, health, all the rest. So it's a complex interaction between the two of them. So that's totally fine. And such things have been described as that, the wicked problems. In there. So a key strategy in trying to solve these and other wicked problems is to strengthen capacities within civil society for informed and sustainable actions. Again, whatever. Community practice and action share commitment to interdisciplinary approaches to grow capacity for change across spatial scales. Across scales and in diverse contexts. Assuming things about what people are doing. Okay. This is where I wanted to come down to. Critical inquiry and and transdisciplinary. Critical inquiry. A few of you may know what I'm about to get into. Universities are uniquely poised to produce knowledge to inform decision-making for social and environmental change, but this will require transformation in academic cultures. Transdisciplinarity offers frameworks that may help in efforts to reorganize disciplinary research to foster tighter coupling between science and society, which is a core goal of transdisciplinary orientation. So, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, multidisciplinary. I apologize if I bungled that in here. The idea with multidisciplinary is you think about research and it's a bunch of M&Ms. And each M&M is a different discipline. They're distinct and unique still, even though they're all mixed together. Interdisciplinary is more like layers of a cake. There's a little bit of a blurring of things in there between things, but you're still seeing things that are separate and distinct. The idea behind transdisciplinarity has to do with, in a project or in something or in some kind of research, there is no boundaries. There is no boundaries between disciplines in the context of a single project. And I should say this is not necessarily meant to be all the time. It's supposed to be with respect to an individual project. At least that the way that I understand it. I have no doubt that there are some folks out there who would want transdisciplinary everywhere, and that would be making me an expert in in something that I'm not somehow at the same time, or that everything that I do suddenly crosses onto everything else. Okay, but that's not what I wanted to get to. So they make an analogy here that we add to, I'm not going to be able to pronounce that, list of metaphors about interdisciplinarity drawn from U.S. and Israeli research contexts to offer one that circulates within SSI, and this is the area that they're working in for this study. You'll see in a second. We do this with the intention that this metaphor becomes a boundary object, a device that enables learning across perspectives. For us, interdisciplinary is not a potluck supper where everyone brings what they have and collaborators pick and choose from the best dishes. Instead, interdisciplinary integration is like cooking a meal together from scratch. In this interdisciplinary meal, every vegetable is essential to the unique flavor, but each ingredient is still detectable as a carrot or a potato. Each member adds the perspective of one's own discipline, yet each member is able to maintain his or her own identity. Thus, cooking a meal in collaboration requires coordination and the combination of different ingredients to produce something fundamentally new, but in a way still holds true to the distinct tastes of those involved in the project. Again, we're crossing disciplines, but everybody stays unique at the same time. Goddamn sound. I apologize if I have a sound problem. Microphone is still not working quite right. I apologize if the sound cuts in and out a little bit here. We'll hopefully fix that bug soon. Key to successful cooking, and by extension research, is a willingness to reflect critically, to identify ways to improve processes and outcomes for all involved, and to promote the generative potential from difference. Here's the thing. Next sentence here is what gets me. Because power is embedded within and constitutive of any knowledge production process, efforts to erase or overcome difference occur through power. All right. Those of you who've become familiar with postmodernism would recognize this immediately. In the postmodernist philosophy, they very much believe that knowledge is a construct of power. Those in power are the ones who determine what is true. In fact, matter, for those of you interested, I highly recommend it. Cynical Theories by James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose. They actually break down what postmodernism is, and I'm going to read a couple of different things. 2 key principles of postmodernism that are relevant here. The postmodern knowledge principle, radical skepticism about whether objective knowledge or truth is attainable, and a commitment to cultural constructivism, meaning that all cultures are identical, effectively, if I recall it correctly. Postmodern political principle, a belief that society is formed of systems of power and hierarchies, which decide what can be known and how. And that's what they're getting into with this, is the idea that that the truth is constructed by, that what is known to be true is constructed by those in power. That is a postmodern thought. Now, here's the problem with that I have with the idea that what is true is only determined by those in power. History of science is the reason I have a problem with that. History of climate science is a good example, actually, because things that are true, and there's another book, I don't have it in here, but on intellectual freedom and the culture wars. It's also a good read. Piers Benn, I believe, is the author. Yes, Piers Benn. But on intellectual freedom and the culture wars, he has a whole first chapter on epistemic virtue. And the interesting thing about it is that he makes a very good point that things that are true will eventually take control in the mainstream, even if they are not brought by those in power. And a good example of that, actually, another book you can read if you're really interested, is The Discovery of Global Warming by Spencer Weir, here in my collection of books. And even in the history of climate science, which is what this book really goes through, there's so many times where different scientists who were not themselves climatologists, not climate scientists, not in the established circle of power, not the most powerful people who set the goals or anything like that, they were the ones who made the most key advances. They came up with what was true. And eventually it got accepted. So an example in the book that they talk about here is in the 1930s, nobody thought that humans could have any influence on the climate. Nobody thought it at all. It was still not up there. And then by the 1960s, that's all they could talk about, was the idea that humans could influence the environment. Humans could influence the climate. something that determines to be true, and this is true. I do believe that we do have evidence. I'm not going to say I do believe because that's a whole other video, but I do know that there's plenty of evidence that humans can influence the climate. A good example, influence the world around them. A good example is the urban heat island effect. An urban area will have much more heat involved with it because of the concrete and asphalt and what have you compared to a surrounding rural area. And you can actually see this in observations. An urban center with a weather station in it will be several degrees warmer than the surrounding rural area. And so that's a very real way that humans have influenced the environment. They talk about this with respect to pollution, and doctors in the 60s were realizing, oh, wait a second, pollution is actually causing deaths of our patients and things along that line. So they talked about it that way. So the thing about this, again, coming back to the idea that knowledge is constructed by those in power and what is true is determined by those in power, no. I don't buy it. History of science actually shows that that's not true. Eventually, it gets accepted and becomes part of the established theory and the consensus of scientists and what have you. But what is true can be determined by anybody. And again, this is why I love divergent perspectives and why I love the idea of actionable science, is because it gives you a question that can give you a view of what is true. And what is true about a particular physical phenomenon question, or question that I might be interested in as a scientist that maybe you thought of a way that I couldn't think of to actually answer that question. So no, I don't buy the postmodern notion that objective truth doesn't exist, which is a postmodernist thought in the knowledge principle here. Objective truth doesn't exist. It's constructed by those in power. There's no difference between the subjective of the individual. The subjective, everything's subjective. Let's put it that way. There is no objective truth. And that's a problem. And I'm amazed that the authors of this study did not bring it up in the fact that science's primary goal is determining the objective truth with respect to different physical processes and questions that we ask. And they bring this up in the context of actionable science. So this is one of the reasons I get concerned about actionable science becoming activist science, because when you start applying postmodernism to science, you are taking away the whole notion of there being objective truth that science is trying to capture. Instead, it's all relative. It's all subjective. The way we look at it with science is all the data that we gather is a view of the same objective truth. And this is eventually a video I want to do, although Cyworthy had a good video on this too. The same objective truth there. We're all taking a view of the same objective truth with just different bits of data that give us a vision on that from a different direction. And the question is, how do we piece it all together? But objective truth is a real thing. I'm sorry, the sun is still shining. Whether you name it the sun or not, that's something else. You could give it a totally different name. Gravity is still real. I don't know what person thought gravity would be a social construct. How was that constructed by somebody in power? Things like that in here. So objective truth still very much exists. There is a thing about subjective experience, and a person's experience can be biased. So you do have subjective experience versus the objective realism of the universe kind of thing going on here. That's a whole other thing, postmodernism versus modernism. I may get into that at some point when I've done a lot more reading on the subject myself. But like I said, this book, Cynical Theories, I highly recommend it. Go out and get it. I will put a Amazon link for you if you want it, or Barnes & Noble, or any number of different links. But that's the thing. Knowledge is not a construct of power. And this is where I get concerned, is if it's more about power and more about satisfying narrative when you come to do actionable science, or coming to satisfy whatever narrative is most suited. You know, here's the best example I can think of right now, talking off the top of my head. Are you more interested in providing the stakeholder with the truth, even if it doesn't give them the answer they wanted to hear? Or are you going to give them the truth? Or are you gonna just give them what they want to hear? So say, oh yeah, this is going to be really, really bad. You should do this. So being careful of a stakeholder being predisposed to wanting to make a particular decision. That can happen. And that kind of not power relationship, but that kind of a relationship, somebody's got a bias toward making a particular decision anyway. So as a scientist being involved in an actionable science relationship, you probably don't want to be involved in that necessarily. If you're being true to who you are as a scientist and what your discipline is meant to do, as science is meant to do, is finding the objective truth and answers to questions, then yes, you should be considering carefully the dynamic there. That be careful that the stakeholders that you're working with want a particular decision. Or want a particular answer so they can justify a particular decision they've already made in their heads. And in the same breath, as a scientist, don't be tempted to go off in your own particular narrative because you want the stakeholder to make a particular decision. You're being entrusted with, these are the options that I have to make for my decision. Don't try to force them into a particular decision. That's you projecting your bias onto them, and that can compromise your own research, even though the scientific method is designed to help make sure people's biases are removed from doing that analysis. It doesn't mean it goes utterly away. So that's the thing. Making sure carefully that for both of you, good actionable science, in my view, for both sides is great, because you have the diverse perspectives, you have great questions, you can get into really amazing nitty-gritty details and all sorts of fun, funky stuff with it, but it has to be about the truth. What is truly the answer to that question? Because the truth is going to be the best thing to plan on. Not something that the stakeholder wants to hear, not something the scientist wants them to do here. So that's the thing. It's got to be about the truth in here. So beware, because I always look at this when I see the whole notions of power and what have you, because postmodernism is a very activist kind of philosophy, as opposed to the modernist and the modernist and Enlightenment principles. At least to the best of my knowledge. I am not perfect on this, but again, postmodernism I've read a lot about recently, so that one rang a bell. Here, so the other thing that concerns me with actionable science is making sure there's tolerance involved. You are inherently, with actionable science, because you're not working necessarily just with those scientists, you are working with somebody who's in a completely different discipline from you. You're working with someone who is a manager, who is a stakeholder, and some of them may have science backgrounds and may have been scientists or are scientists and just ended up in an administrative role. But they've got a different worldview than you do. There's different worldviews between scientists and decision makers and planners and managers and stakeholders and even just general public and what have you. Being tolerant of those different worldviews and building that relationship when you do actionable science is incredibly important. So you can't go running in guns blazing, wanting things to be your own way. And that also goes back to the activist mentality in there too. So yeah, that's my kind of thing. Actionable science, overall, I think it's a really good thing. Just got to be careful that it doesn't become activist science, and actionable science still stays about the truth, even if it's truth that neither side really wants to hear, and all that. And also being tolerant. It is a practice of being tolerant of different worldviews at the same time, because you are building a relationship with somebody who's very different from you, be it you, the stakeholder, talking with the scientist, or the scientist talking with the stakeholder. But you end up having to make these really, really interesting relationships. So you have to be tolerant. You have to be tolerant. You have to be empathetic. The elitism thing that I mentioned in the last video, you can't do actionable science and come in with an elitist attitude. It doesn't work. You turn each of you, whether it be the stakeholder or the scientist, you'll turn each other off if you come in with an elitist kind of view. Doing actionable science. So I think that's it for me. Overall, I like actionable science. It's a great concept. And I think it has a lot of potential going forward into the future, getting some really unique answers to science questions, particularly as the science questions themselves become incredibly complicated. But just gotta be careful with it, because I do worry about there being advocacy and activism that seeps its way in, particularly when I see things like this, where postmodernism is very activist-like and has led to a lot of things that I'm not comfortable with nowadays. So yeah, I think that's it for me here. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, hit like, share, subscribe, comment, all that good jazz. Comment below. Tell me what you think. I'd be curious your thoughts on the idea of actionable science. If this is the first time you've ever heard of it before, more content like that, or any number of different things. Also, if you want to interact with me, head over to SciWorthy, the SciWorthy Locals group, sciworthy.locals.com, sciworthy.locals.com. And of course, we'll be there answering questions and chatting. We'll be doing more SciWorthy conversations soon. We're taking a brief break from that, just because my coworkers off on a break for a little while. But we will come back to that soon. I don't know which topic we're going to do next, but we'll find out. We will find out. Anyway, that's it for now. So I'm Adrian, signing off. Until next time, stay curious, my friends.